But then that begs a question. If that's the case, then why aren't gamers doing better at reading in school, right? I've spent years looking at the literacy practice of gamers, but it turns out that if you look at the performance in literacy in school of some of the biggest gamers out there on the market for something like MMOs, the games I study, which are boys, it tells a different kind of story. So why boys? Well, first off, for online games, whether we like it or not, boys are still the predominant market. World of Warcraft has a better gender breakdown than any other game, but the highest I've ever seen it go was around 18% girls. 18%. We're 50% of the universe. 50%. But we're only 18% of the demographic at best for MMOs. So MMOs tend to be largely male audiences. It turns out, as Henry Jenkins and other scholars have argued, that games are the contemporary equivalent of traditional boys' play spaces in many ways. So boys are a predominant audience for these particular kinds of games that we're studying, and yet they only graduate at 65% from high school, and oftentimes boys are opting out and totally underperforming in literacy-related coursework. They consistently score lower on the NAEP. On average, nationally, boys read about 2 grades below level. So if games are recruiting all these literacy practices, why aren't boys the majority audience for games? Why are they not faring better in school when it comes to reading and writing? Well, let's take a look. So first thing we did was we picked 25 boys. About half of them were struggling readers. Half of them were non-struggling readers. And we followed them longitudinally through playing World of Warcraft to look at what texts do they read, how are they reading them, how do they fit into their everyday lives. How is it that games are placed in the lives of young people who are actually playing them? Now, what's interesting here is that we studied this cadre of kids for about 8 months, and we followed them ethnographically to look at how are games, what kind of gaming are they doing, what texts are they using, like how does it connect up to their other world activities. And what's interesting here is that in our group, even though half of our population was struggling readers, when we watched them actually reading and leveraging text around the game, they were reading text with perfect comprehension. How do we know that? Well, because they were reading complicated texts that we were taking the reading levels of, which were 12th grade, 13th grade, 14th grade, and up, and yet they were able to draw inferences off of those texts, obviously understanding the text, and use it as a way to inform their gameplay. We would watch and see that information in the text was being leveraged in their gameplay, so there must be some basic comprehension going. Yet, half of them are marked as struggling readers in school. So we decided to do an experiment, and the basic research question we had was, well, maybe the way that kids are reading text related to games and the way that they're reading text related to schools, maybe they're using different strategies, maybe there's something going on that's different about if you compare the two kinds of reading practices. We first gave them the official QRI, so we gave them a reading assessment level that told us the actual reading level at that point in time of the boys, of each child. And then we wanted to compare their reading performances on 2 different types of text, one school-based text and one game-based text. Both of them were texts that we pulled right out of the resources they were using, literally pulling it right out of their textbook or right off of the websites we knew that they were using because we had documented it. And we looked to see, okay, if we make sure the reading text is appropriate to their current reading level, what do they do differently about strategies? Are they approaching these 2 texts differently? Is there something that's differently happening on those 2 texts that would account for the differences that we see in broad sales, sort of aggregated results nationally? So here's a sample of 9th and 10th grade text pulled from the game. Here's a sample of text pulled straight from a textbook. What do we find? All of our kids were reading at or below level. Struggling readers were reading up to 5 or 6 grades below their level. Non-struggling readers were at grade level. And we looked to see, are there differences in how they're approaching the text, whether it's school-based or game-based? Turns out no difference. We saw no differences in strategies, no difference in comprehension when we controlled for difficulty of text. So we thought about it. We went back to the drawing board, continued to study the kids ethnographically, kept seeing that struggling readers were reading text at times, not just 12th grade, but college-level text without a comprehension problem. So we thought, well, there must be something here that we're missing. So we decided to go back and do one more study. And this time what we did is we asked ourselves, what would happen if they chose the game text that they actually got to read? So this time, instead of us picking the text from school and picking the text from games that we decided was appropriate, that matched their current reading level as diagnosed by the QRI, what we did this time instead was to go to every single participant and say, what is a topic right now that you're interested in reading more about to help your game play? Each participant gave us 3 topics, and our research team scrambled out to find text on a topic the kid was interested in that was at least 12th grade, because that's the basic average level of game text. We wanted to make sure it was hard text, so it had to be at least 2 grades harder than what they should be able to handle. And we looked to see, what do they do when we hand that to them now? So it turns out that in this study, for example, the average reading level of the text that we picked was 13th grade, pretty hard. The average difference between the text reading difficulty and the current diagnosis of reading level for our participants was up to 4.5 grades difference. So we made it hard text for them. And what did we find out? We found that when allowed to choose the text topic, our participants read up to 8 grades above their level. If you split the data into struggling and non-struggling readers, our struggling readers had to read text that was 5.3 grades above their level. Our non-struggling readers, on average, had to read text that was 4.3 grades above their level. And struggling readers and non-struggling readers alike read with near perfect comprehension. More importantly for me, what you found was that there were no longer any differences in performance for our struggling and non-struggling readers. In other words, when we allowed our participants to choose the topic of their text, struggling readers looked just like non-struggling readers. Struggling readers looked just like successful readers. How is that possible? Why? Is it, for example, something about prior knowledge? Remember that we had, in fact, allowed participants to choose the topic they were reading about. So one hypothesis could be, well, maybe they're choosing topics they know something about. The fact that they know something about it makes it easier to read. That's actually true. Reading about something you know facts about, that you know something about, that's in your domain, makes reading a lot easier. So was that it? Nope. There was no relationship between prior knowledge measures and their reading performance. Instead, what we found is when we went back to look at the transcripts of reading across our first study and our second study, we found some really interesting differences in what's called a self-correction rate. Now, forgive me for a moment while I nerd out on literacy stuff. So, a good reader still runs into reading problems, right? There's a weird B in subtle. Every time I hit it, I stumble and I think, what is the word? Oh, it's subtle. Okay, it's just got a strange B in it. Okay, and you move on. You repair the reading problem and you correct it. You move on from there. So successful readers have reading challenges. It's just that they're able to repair that particular reading challenge and comprehension problem and move forward. Non-struggling readers hit those same comprehension problems and actually can't repair them on the fly. Now, when we compared kids reading text, game text, from the first study, where we chose the topic and we made sure it was their appropriate level, we found about 17% of self-correction rate. When we actually let them choose the topic, you find that that number more than doubles. It goes up to 36%. You have the kids who are struggling readers and non-struggling, but struggling is the more important population for this. Kids that are struggling readers are actually fixing their comprehension problems on the fly in text when they care about the topic that they're reading. In fact, what you would call persistence in the face of challenges. Now, this should sort of give us a no-duh moment, right? But it's one that we forget in schools all the time. So in one of our pre-interviews of our assessment, we interviewed every single participant about their attitudes toward reading. One of our struggling readers, who was in 11th grade, reading at the 6th grade level, we asked him, do you like to read? And he said, I don't know. No, it matters what I'm reading. It matters what I'm reading. So what's going on in this study? It turns out that it matters what you're reading. When you care about making sense of a topic, you are more inclined to fix your comprehension problems and persist in the face of challenges than when you don't care about comprehension of the topic. This matters because in schools, we oftentimes act as though interest doesn't matter, or as though it's sort of the chocolate on the broccoli. It's kind of a nice thing to have, but in the end of the day, performance is what matters. And part of what these data are suggesting is that actually interest is part of performance. Interest highly influences performance. I had gone in to much of this work thinking about games as sort of a gateway into other kinds of practices. How do we use games as a means to invigorate or interest kids in kind of my educational goals? But part of what this suggests is something that's a little bit trickier and hard to do, but may very well be one of the most important points I can make. And that's that in some ways we have to shift from thinking about games as a means for accomplishing our educational goals and instead start thinking about education as a means for accomplishing kids' goals. So games are not replacing reading and writing. As much as we worry about the lives of children and literacy in the United States and other countries, it's hard to argue once you take seriously what players are doing, that games are somehow replacing reading and writing instead of simply sitting in the ecosystem of those practices and reconfiguring them in certain ways. Should we be afraid of the ways that they're reconfiguring them? I don't think we should. I think in some ways what we're seeing is that games provide a context in which reading and writing are interest-driven. And it may very well be that interest-driven forms of reading, for example, are far more powerful interventions than asking kids to read text that simply has very little meaning for them in the actual lives of what they're interested in.